Today, we're just going to be looking at the different perspectives from different people with different religious or non-religious backgrounds, and talk about how mindfulness and meditation can be used depending on those different contexts. So just before we start, I'll just briefly explain what we mean by mindfulness and meditation, just so we have a clear idea of what we're talking about from the outset. So when we talk about mindfulness, we're talking about being fully aware of whatever's going on in your current experience. So you're not thinking about the past or worrying about the future. You're just completely in the present moment. And then meditation is practicing becoming more mindful. So there are lots of different types of meditation, but they can all help you cultivate mindfulness. It often includes using an anchor to the present moment, such as the breath. So one of the most common forms of meditation is sitting and watching your breath, and the breath acts as an anchor to the present moment. So if we just can go into some introductions, and you can meet everybody here. So let's start with William.
Hello, I'm Dr. William Van Gordon. I'm Associate Professor of Contemplative Psychology at the University of Derby in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to share with you my perspective as a Buddhist practitioner today.
Great, thank you, William. And Ado?
Hello, everyone. So my name is Adil Salim. I'm the Muslim chaplain at the University of Birmingham. I'm also head of religious affairs at Green Lane Mosque in Birmingham, in the United Kingdom. So in this session, I'll be giving the Islamic Muslim perspective of mindfulness and meditation.
Thank you, Ado. Fiona, I think we might be getting some feedback from you. So if you could mute when you're not speaking, that would be great.
Okay.
Great, thank you. And Ananya?
Hi, I'm Dr. Nanya Avasti. I work as the Assistant Director for the Harvard School of Public Health's India Research Center, and I write on the intersection of meditation, mindfulness, and its impact on public health.
Great, thank you. And Dominic?
Hello, everybody. My name's Dominic O'Neill. I studied physics with astrophysics and then worked as a science educator for around 5 years. And I'll be representing the atheist or agnostic perspective in today's discussion.
Great, thank you. And Fiona?
Hi, my name is Fiona Igwe, and I study biological sciences. I'm also the CEO and founder of the Atheist Project, CIC, and I'll be giving a Christian perspective on meditation.
Great, thank you. And yeah, thank you all for being here, taking the time. So I think to begin with, it would be great to hear how you all use meditation or mindfulness in your day-to-day practice, and whether you use it as part of your spiritual kind of connection, and how it ties into your religious practice on a regular basis. So maybe if we could start with Dominic.
Okay, yeah, so I meditate daily. I try to meditate twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening. Usually in the mornings, I find I'm more dedicated in the morning. I find that I can get into a state where I feel more comfortable meditating. However, I often use it as a way to center myself. And I think that as somebody who isn't particularly religious and never really has had a strong sense of spirituality, let's say, or I wasn't necessarily raised in a religious environment, I think meditation is probably the closest to prayer that I come in my daily life. And in terms of what I use it for, I think it's very useful for me to, in a very vague explanation, is centering myself. But I think for me, those who pray often focus on specific issues they might be having in their life. They ask for guidance. perhaps things that they desire. They ask God to help them with those things, or gods if they believe in more than one God. And I think that simply focusing on those issues and internally prioritizing them or defining them, whether you're asking help from a God or whether you are simply doing it for your own sense of clarity, is something that's very beneficial. And that's probably the one of two major benefits that I find I have with meditation. It's that I can focus on issues that internally I give myself some kind of clarity, which then externalize itself in some kind of order in my life. So yeah, that's how it kind of ties into my day-to-day life, and how I think that it not necessarily replaces prayer for me, but it at least gives me some of those benefits that I might not be getting.
Okay, great, thank you. Adil, maybe you could kind of talk about how that kind of fits in for you, and also it was interesting hearing about your connecting meditation to prayer. So Adil, maybe if you could talk about if there's any similarities in that area for you as well.
Yeah, so as a Muslim, meditation is part of our daily life. So our aim is to get closer to God, and by doing that, a form of meditation is needed for that. I think meditation in general, it's sort of like a loose term, where when you hear of it, it means something else or it means something different to various people. So for me as a Muslim, my aim is to get closer to God, and we could do that in many ways. Praying, we pray 5 times a day, and that for me is a form of meditation, which ultimately helps me to get to that goal of every time, or 5 times a day, I'll sit down, I'll pray. Before I pray, I prepare myself mentally, spiritually, and then obviously whilst I'm praying, it's like my connection with God. And then obviously once I finish, and then again there's like a moment of reflection where you remember God, you praise Him. So yeah, I mean, meditation in the life of a Muslim ultimately is a way of getting closer to God, and everything that we do leads us to that. So whether it's a good deed, whether it's a good action, whether it's just sitting down, not necessarily in a particular place, or even in a trance, like you might find some people. It's genuinely just sitting down and remembering God, and trying to get closer to Him. So that's practically how that is implemented in the daily life of a Muslim, really.
Nice, yeah, that's really nice. Cool. And Fiona, I guess, do you kind of recognize any of what Adil said in the same way that you use meditation? Do you feel that connection to God when you meditate?
Yes, I do. Firstly, I just want to add a point that so prayer, to like, for it on a Christian perspective, is not just asking for things or asking God for, to take away our troubles. It really is praising God as well, most importantly, and giving thanks to God and asking to help us through our troubles. But yeah, so as a Christian, the first thing that we should do is, confess our sins. The first thing we should do when we come before God is to confess our sins and acknowledge our wrongdoings, therefore, and ask for forgiveness. And then from there, we praise, which is giving thanks to God. And then after praise, it's prayer. So again, prayer could be just, telling God our problems, asking God to help us, get through the issues. And then Bible study comes into it, us remembering God's words. But in terms of meditation, after meditation is more so reflecting on God's words and God's promises for us. You know, for example, if I'm in a stage of my life where I'm full of anxiety, where I have anxiety or I'm worried, I'll listen to Bible verses, Christian meditation on YouTube, which, you know, basically, you know, reads the Bible verses, and, you know, reminds us that, you know, God did not give us the spirit of fear or of, you know, anxiety, you know, the power to be, you know, confident and to be bold. So
yeah,
so that's Christian meditation.
great. That's super interesting. Yeah. I think so. And Ananya, when it comes to kind of recognizing a connection with God, with meditation, in the Vedantic form of Hinduism, am I right in thinking that it's non-dual? So kind of you are one with God in that sense. And so I guess, yeah, it would be great to hear what you think on that. And when you meditate, does it make you feel closer to that oneness? Yeah, interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. Yeah. I'll answer both the questions, but probably in the reverse order. I'll start in terms of how I thought and perceived what God meant and how it has changed over ages. Just interacting with what meditation or mindfulness really means for me as of today. So when I was growing up in a Hindu household, I was always taught to take a moment in the day and just bow your head down and close your hands and just declutter your mind. I remember I used to ask my mom, what am I supposed to think or say or do, while I am, so my mom's calling. Okay. So I would ask her so what am I supposed to do? What's the prayer? What does prayer mean, being a Hindu? And she would tell me it starts with pure focus, pure attention to the present that you're living. And so it was not a very theosophical, perception or conception of God, but she would teach me to, let things go, be in the present, learn how to focus, learn how to bring your attention to an object, which could be a deity in this case. But similarly, I remember that I was not very great at maths. And when my father would tell me that, are you not putting enough dhyan? So dhyan is Hindi for meditation. And he would be like, put full dhyan and do this math problem. And so focus or attention was also taught as a spiritual objective, which could be then, brought into various aspects of my life. And, she would, or my father would always give me the example that, all these mathematicians, all these scientists are ultimately meditating. They are so focused on their object of attention. And that's what meditation is. It could be focused attention on God, on a theological God, on a religious God for a lot of sects. It could be an idea, it could be a conception, it could also just mean, I remember at times I read that, okay, just focusing between your two eyebrows could probably be meditation, and it could be a very, very secular objective of attention for somebody who's agnostic. So going up from there, I think in terms of, to your question on how I got more attracted to the whole philosophy of non-dualism, which is the Vedantic philosophy or the Upanishadic philosophy. A lot of Buddhism, the initial beginning of Buddhism and Jainism also picked up from the Upanishadic traditions. So in that sense, the more I read and the more I practiced, I realized that the final objective of, say, yoga or mindfulness or meditation is really understanding the true nature of reality, which is very metaphysical when you talk about non-dualism. And being a science student, reading a lot of metaphysics, reading a lot of quantum physics, I realized that there was a very simple saying when I was young, and it said that every grain of sand has Ram, and Ram is a god, for Hindus. And now when I come to think of quantum physics, and I realize, okay, that every material is just a manifestation of that, universal consciousness, I think it has definitely brought me closer to God, but in a very metaphysical sense. But I think this non-dualistic outlook has also made me more tolerant and more accepting of this reality that we live in, and that's when the whole differentiation between sects, religions, cultures, colors sort of, tend to disappear. Even your interaction with the environment, with animals, I mean, all of that sort of, melt down in a pot together. So I think in that sense, and then again, being a public health professional, I think this whole idea of service orientation. So there's a modern Hindu saint who's Swami Vivekanand, and he's linked non-dualism to service orientation. And he says you don't need a god in a temple. You can so very well worship all the people in the world who are so much less privileged than you. Since the whole reality is so non-dualistic, serving people is a way to serve God. So I think that service orientation is another outlook by which you can think of going closer to God. So whether it be your personal relationship with God, whether it be your scientific outlook towards life, or whether it be a scientific orientation, I think all of that is sort of converged at this point when I answer this question in terms of what is meditation in a religious context, at least as far as my personal life goes, has brought me to as of now. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I love that. That's beautiful. And I think you touched on some really important things there about tolerance and acceptance, and serving other people, and taking that even further and saying kind of respecting animals, and I guess that comes down basically to kind of showing compassion. But I think we'll come back to that a bit more in a moment. Before we do that, William, I think there are similarities between Hinduism and Buddhism, right? But as far as I know, I'm not an expert at all, but there's definitely less of a focus on God, if I'm right.
In Buddhism, yes. I think it depends on how you relate to God and how you interpret that concept. There are many different views of God. It's a very broad term. Mm-hmm. But for myself, meditation can be a useful tool to help tap into the potential that self exists within the mind, within my mind, and indeed within everybody's mind. So it's a tool, from my perspective, for journeying inwards, in order to tap into spiritual potential, in order to develop spiritually and waken up. But personally, I try not to relate to meditation so much as a practice. I try not to draw too much of a distinction between meditation, something that you sit down and do at different times throughout the day, and the rest of my life. For me, meditation is a way of life, a way of being, and it should be spontaneous. It should allow you very much to engage with life, to enjoy life, not something that you need to take time out of life in order to go and do. So that's my thought about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think when it comes to implementing it in your day-to-day life, and kind of trying to be mindful all of the time, and kind of constantly being in this, I guess in a way of meditation, I guess it might be difficult for some people, especially if they kind of haven't been, if they haven't tried meditating, if they haven't really, I guess if they're not acting in a mindful way a lot of the time. I guess especially nowadays when we live in a world full of technology and constant distraction, and I guess to begin with, you might need to take some time to practice being mindful or being in this meditative state. I guess with the end goal of eventually I guess it's like developing a skill. So eventually you could be kind of meditative all the time. Do you think?
I'd agree with that in part. Okay. Yeah, I think taking small steps and using kind of meditative anchors such as observing the breath, those are useful means in order to start embracing in order to start using this practice as part of one's life. But I think you've got to start out with the right perspective. If you start out with the perspective that this is a practice, you're right from the beginning, you're separating yourself from meditation, and that can create issues or obstacles further down the line. Whereas if you start out with the perspective that my life is meditation, I can meditate wherever I am. There are tools I can use to facilitate that practice, but I'm not reliant on them. Meditation is going to draw on skill sets, if you like, that are naturally present within me. And I think that's a better approach to start with.
Yeah, I really like that. That's really nice. Great. I think, Dominic, if we can go back to something else that William just said about an interpretation of God, and it can be different for different people, and it can represent kind of connection to kind of the universe, one might say. Being a physicist and an atheist / agnostic, have you considered that kind of idea that, or maybe when you're meditating, taking into account a kind of a connection with nature? I think there was Spinoza who kind of talked about the idea of God being nature, and I think Einstein, I know there are lots of different quotes about Einstein and God, but it kind of came down to an admiration to the laws of physics, and kind of seeing science as God in a way, or nature and the laws of physics being God, but it just comes down to interpretation of the word, really. What do you think of that? Have you kind of had any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, so I mean, Spinoza's philosophy is really fascinating, and it's beautiful the way he interprets, well, the way he interprets nature in the universe, and his kind of the main central idea of his philosophy is that he didn't really consider God a personified thing. He didn't think God was a person with an agenda who was judging our individual actions, who would punish us for our evils or sins, or who would congratulate us or reward our virtue at the end of our lives. It was more a kind of quasi-scientific idea that he is in everything, and it's what you were saying, Ananya. Every grain of sand, every all these mathematicians and scientists who are meditating when they're working, they're trying to understand the universe. They're trying to understand nature, and it's this idea that, I mean, he proposed there are two ways of going about the world. There's my Latin's not very good, so it's species durationis, which is under the aspect of time, and it's looking at the local, it's like an egoistical view where you're focused on the issues that are in my life and the issues that are in my time, and it's quite short-sighted. And then he suggested this subspecies eternitatis, which is something like under the aspect of eternity. And he believed that by studying the universe, by studying the laws of nature, physics and science, and really understanding how the world works, that's really knowing God, and we're partaking in eternity by doing that. And I really think that's really a beautiful idea. You read that if you can study the same laws, that's something that's eternal. It's something that, as far as we know, doesn't change and will never change, and the state of the world will change. The laws in which, physical laws on which we rely, on which we exist, they don't change, so they're going to be the same. I can connect with him in the 17th century or with Aristotle thousands of years ago through those ideas, and that's something that's beautiful to me. One thing that I really liked about Spinoza's philosophy, which he drew upon from Seneca, I believe, is one of the Stoics in ancient Rome, and he had this idea, which is quite a comic idea, of we're like dogs with leads wrapped around our necks, and if we try and fight against nature, if we try and fight against the way the world works, whether it be the laws of the body, aging, something like that, whether it's the laws of physics, whether it's how society works, then we're going to be strangling ourselves. And it's a much better approach to understand how the world works, understands the necessities that we have to accept, and then learn how to be in harmony with that. And yeah, it's I mean, his idea was that we can find God, and I mean, it's what you said, Adil, about coming closer to God, and that's his objective. I'm going to come closer to God, but I'm going to do it by understanding the world. And I think one way in which he almost fell short, Spinoza, was that he failed to almost recognize how much we rely upon religion for things other than just the mind, other than just rationality, but also beauty and love. And Fiona, when you were saying about reading Bible passages to help you with anxiety or other issues, I think there's a certain poetry in that beauty that I think Kant touched upon. He focused on a little bit more, and I think is that kind of sense, that spirituality that also needs to be nurtured in people. But yeah, I think that's probably the closest I've come to religious, is being religious is reading about Spinoza's version of God. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, that's really nice. And yeah, and just one last thing about kind of the connection with nature. I know, William, you wrote a paper or an article around that, didn't you? And do you find that kind of meditating on connection with nature, or even meditating in nature, does nature kind of help you come to a meditative state, or do you find that meditating on kind of a gratitude for nature can help you kind of feel more at peace? What do you think about that?
Yes, I think so. Contemplative practitioners have used nature as an aid, as a meditative aid for thousands of years. It's quieter in nature. It is perhaps for some people easier to still the mind in that setting, but it's important we feel connected to nature. We're a part of nature, and yet understanding just how intricately we're connected to nature and depend on nature is essential for our well-being, I think, and it's a useful topic of meditation to explore that, to explore just how closely we are connected to nature. For example, we breathe in the out breath of the trees. We drink, in one sense, the rain, the rivers, the oceans. We're inseparable from nature, and so from the point of view of overcoming attachment to the self, overcoming ego, then contemplating on nature connectedness is very useful. It's a good way to kind of help get over ourselves a little bit and understand just how dependent we are on everything else that exists.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I really like that. And personally, I find kind of feeling that connection to nature, that really helps me kind of get to that kind of meditative state. Yeah, it's really cool. If we move on slightly, there's another topic I wanted to ask you about. So in a book called Mindfulness, I don't know if you've heard of it, by somebody called Ronald E. Purser, he argues that kind of in this modern day age where you have lots of people talk about mindfulness now, and lots of people talk about meditation, and you can get subscriptions to meditation platforms, and he kind of argues against the capitalization of it, and says that it kind of shouldn't, or that kind of lacks the kind of moral behavior that should go along with meditation, and kind of sets of it's been stripped of its teachings around kind of compassion and that kind of thing. Adil, how do you tie in things like compassion or kind of moral behavior or ethical behavior in terms of Islam? Is that tied to kind of mindfulness or meditative practice?
Yeah, of course. I think one of those underpinning belief about Islam is the belief in one God. So everything we do is essentially leads to that. So, for example, when we're, like you said, our moral compass, the way we are, the way we behave, the way we interact, the way we are with our parents, the way we are with our peers, our character, everything is essentially a way of improving ourselves and getting closer to God. So, like a shortened answer to your question is yes, of course, every aspect of our life is a means to get closer to God, whether that's meditation, whether that's being mindfulness, whether that's being mindful, and of course, everything that encompasses that. So our character with other people, how are we with our neighbors, how are we with our friends, the language that we use, our behavior, being honest, respecting people. This all falls under that concept of mindfulness, and being mindful, just making sure that the people around us, we're not harming them or we're not hurting them, we're respecting them, we're being kind to them. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And Fiona, I guess in terms of Christianity, there's I'm guessing there's probably a similar kind of line of thinking in terms of kind of treating your neighbours well and being nice to people, generally showing compassion. Do you have anything do you have anything to add to that in terms of how you might use Christian meditation, and does that tie in ways of kind of encouraging compassion and selflessness?
I think with Christianity, in terms of good morals, I guess, we were given our first set of, instructions, you could say, in the Old Testament, when God gave us the 10 Commandments. And then Jesus came along and then he said, he gave us the golden rule, which is to love one another as I've loved you. So I guess we do always, go back to those 10 Commandments and go back to not only just what Jesus said, but how, Jesus lived his life, and his life was full of love. He showed love unto others, regardless of their race or religion. And just going back to what, I forgot who said it, but someone said service to others is a way of getting closer to God. And it really is. And I believe that as a Christian, you should make your life a prayer. So making sure you're good to others, you're good to your neighbours, if you have, then give. And also to not judge others and to just show love and compassion to one another. So treat others as you would like to be treated.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think it's just incorporating love and compassion into your practice, but also into your day-to-day lives. And I think it goes hand in hand, I think, with mindfulness, because it's being mindful of how you behave and how you act, how you treat others. But Ananya, it was you, right, who said about the service orientation, giving yourself in service to others, and you also talked about tolerance and acceptance. Could you say a bit more about that service orientation? How exactly is that framed in Hinduism?
Yeah. So as I was saying, within Hinduism, of course, Hinduism has a lot of schools. So I think a fundamental philosophy of Hinduism is that there are so many ways to reach towards the truth. Nobody can really claim that this is the way to, your path of, deliverance or some such thing. So in that sense, Vedanta is one of the thoughts of Hinduism. And within that, when we talk about non-dualistic entities, there's a conception of Atma, which is soul, and Paramatma, which is, the universal consciousness. And what it says is that there is obviously this energy which we conceive and understand as God. And, Dominic already, I think, on that idea of metaphysical reality of self and God, it does talk about how different people, different beings, different animals, different species, they're all manifestations of this essential, universal energy that is manifesting in different forms. So I think in terms of service orientation, once your world outlook changes and you realize that, all the human beings or the different species of animals or plants, they're just at different stages of consciousness, in terms of just evolution, right? Um, and that, there is just, varying degrees of consciousness between a grain of sand and a talking and speaking person who's, on a video call right now. So when you do realize that, I think that's the first step in terms of service orientation really becomes, canceling out or going and seeing beyond yourself or seeing beyond ego. I mean, unless you can see beyond self and see things in perspective, like it's like a bird's point of view, that okay, you are this one clog in this wheel and there's so much else that there's happening. So I think that change in perspective, when you talk about non-dualistic Vedant, pretty much makes you realize that okay, it's not just me who's worried, it's not just me who's in a COVID-19 lockdown, it's not just me who's lost a job, and it's not just me who's having some personal issues within the family. And that's, I think that's very humbling. And you realize that you are not the center of all that's going wrong in the world. When you read the science behind meditation and mindfulness, an important concept is decentering. So for a lot of stress management and anxiety management, you have to learn to decenter and sort of de-link the depressive emotional states that may be attached to the experiences that you see. So I say that in terms of service orientation, that's the first step in terms of being able to go beyond self. And then the second step is when you are able to see that there are so many others who may be lesser privileged than you. And of course, if you're in the position not just of power, but in the position of knowledge, right? As a public health practitioner, at best you have knowledge to share it with people, where you can bring about a change. So I think in that sense, Vivekanand, who's I would say a modern Hindu philosopher late in the 18th century, picks up from the colonial perspective that once if your country is sort of being ruled by colonial power, then there's how do you conceive God in a situation where 70% of your people are below the poverty line, right? It talks about those times where famines and all of that, people were beginning to realize that beyond beyond a temple, beyond a deity, there is a real life that's panning out in front of you. So in that sense, he brings in that orientation, and that in the modern era, you don't need to do a trip or go to travel thousands of kilometers to just go below a deity, but you can see so many people out there, really manifestations of the same energy that you are. And hence there is an obligation towards people who are more privileged in terms of education, in terms of knowledge, in terms of just opportunities to be able to give it back. And I really think of it in terms of, since the establishment of UN post World War II, I think that universal feeling, right? I mean, before the World War II, there was all this, thinking about different nation states, different religions, I mean, still there is. But I think with the setting up of UN, with the focus on sustainable development goals, with the focus on human development goals, somewhere or the other, we are talking about, the well-being of the world, and what is it that countries, at that level, countries can do for each other in terms of environment, in terms of food security, in terms of health, in terms of women rights. It's not just my problem in, if it's not a problem in my backyard, it doesn't mean that I, don't have to be bothered about it. So that world thinking is anyway very much part of the modern thought that we have. And I think service orientation, if you sort of triangulate whatever we understand of, how international governance works, or how we understand non-dualism, I mean, that philosophy sort of pervades through Christianity in terms of, do what you would do to yourself, do to a neighbor what you would do to yourself. Or whether you talk about Sufi philosophy, it always talks about blurring the lines between self and the world, or an atheistic metaphysical point of view, or a Buddhist point of view of just how interconnected everything is. I would just like to close with saying that mindfulness in that sense is very democratic, that in the way that it brings the focus on self. And to William's point, it talks you to sort of uncover and really understand and sort of demystify the potential that you have. So in that sense, meditation can be seen as a way, as a tool to connect with people, develop that service orientation, have empathy, but also to really develop the mind, body, and the energy that is needed to really bring about a change as far as putting words into action is concerned.
I think, can I just follow up on that, Ananya? I think it's very useful to embed meditation and mindfulness within a context of moral values, within a service context, within a context of personal or professional development or spiritual development. There's so many people becoming interested now in meditation and mindfulness, so many books being written about it, so many teachers available now. Sometimes I give a talk or a workshop on mindfulness, and maybe people who I know outside of the context of that workshop, that they might be very kind of ordinary people, and then I'll see them in a different setting, and they've changed because now maybe we're doing a mindfulness retreat or a mindfulness workshop, and they might start to take on different behaviours. Maybe often they'll walk with a smile, with their head half bent to the side, and they stop being who they are. They're allowing mindfulness and meditation, in a sense, to use them rather than them use it as a tool. So I think we have to be careful about that. We have to relate to mindfulness and meditation in the right context, not become attached to it, not fall into the trap of muck mindfulness, adopting a superficial approach to this practice. And if we do that, then it can be very, very useful. But I think today it's wise, it's advisable just to be a touch cautious. Just make sure we're approaching this practice in the right way, in a wholesome way, and that we're using it. It's not using us.
Yeah, I really like that. And yeah, there's definitely a good point you make there about not becoming attached to meditation. We've had discussions at Medito about in the app we have a street counter, and we talked about whether that is beneficial or not, because people might get too attached to their streak, and in a way it's good because it can encourage people to start that regular practice and to encourage them to keep coming back to it. But on the other hand, maybe it's too much of an attachment. So yeah, I think there's definitely some wider conversation for us to have about that in terms of the app as well. But yeah, very good point that you raised there.
Yeah. There are just a line to that. It depends on, it goes back to your question on whether meditation is a tool or a practice that you think exists in the world, how to do it. And, if you're under stress, or if you want to achieve a certain goal or perspective, which may not be obviously materialistic, but, suppose you just want to be calm. So that's one perspective of looking towards meditation. But when you go back to your original question on how to be mindful without being conscious of the fact that you are being mindful, or that you are being meditating, or that you are meditating, I think anybody who is being mindful or who is meditating knows that the ground rule is that you have to be emotionally detached. I mean, it cannot happen if you're you cannot be mindful or meditating if you're so emotionally attached. You might be claiming that, but technically the whole idea of meditation is to be able to sort of detach yourself, your mind from self, and being able to, go beyond that. So it just depends on what you think you want to make of meditation, because really, for me, I think if meditation or mindfulness is something that makes sense to me, then I would rather sort of subsume my general consciousness into these parameters that I would like to practice while sitting in a room, doing meditation. So that's very difficult to come about. It might take a lifetime, but that would certainly be a goal that I would want to yearn for.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I definitely agree. I think that having that emotional detachment from it is definitely something that you might get over time. So when you first, if you're completely new to meditation, then when you sit down to meditate for the first time, thoughts will almost certainly come into your head. You'll get distracted from your object of focus, distracted from your breath, and you might be frustrated by that, and you'll be annoyed at yourself for your mind wandering away. But I think I guess the key is to try not to be frustrated. Recognize that it will happen, that your mind will wander, and over time you can it's practicing becoming less attached, I guess. And with practice, your mind will wander less, but also you can be less attached to any idea that your mind shouldn't be wandering. You can just be aware of any thoughts that come as they come, and just watch them come and go, and be mindful that way. Yeah,
I could add on to that. I think that's why it's so important that there are resources such as Medito that are, the fact that it's a completely voluntary organization, that gives it a sense of trust. People know that there's goodwill there, and the guided meditations are so useful to help people through those initial phases when they are getting distracted. It happens to me every single time I get distracted, and I've learned now that I don't necessarily need a recording to remind me not to judge myself for it. But initially, of course, I would have that frustration, and to have somebody to guide you through that process. Don't judge yourself. It's okay. It's normal to be distracted. Just bring your attention back to your breathing, and you become practiced at that. And then subsequently, once you practice that skill, it's almost like muscle memory in other situations, in other circumstances. As you were saying, William, it's not necessarily, you're not just being mindful in dedicated sessions. It's something you're perhaps in that meditative state throughout the rest of your day. And you might find yourself in a conversation with somebody, getting distracted, and you observe yourself, and don't judge yourself. Okay, I'm getting distracted now. I need to actually focus back on their voice and listen to their point. And the reason I think it's so important, and it's such concern that you do notice that some groups now are capitalizing on the popularity of meditation and trying to make money out of it. It really, it creates this distrust towards meditation and towards apps such as Medito or these kind of resources. And it's often, that we're very prone to corruption as a species, and it's what puts people off a lot of organized religion. It's the same principle. It's when suddenly you've got these beautiful ideas, a lot of social cohesion, people coming together, sharing in struggles, supporting each other in different ways. And as soon as there's this inkling of, are people using this to make money, then a lot of trust goes out the window. So I think it's really important that there are organizations like Medito where people are just giving up their time because they want to, because they've seen how important these things can be for them in their daily lives. And one more thing I just wanted to add, which kind of both of you touched upon a bit, Ananya and William, is that having this detachment from mindfulness, not necessarily not letting it replace your personality or your identity. You can be somebody who's mindful, but that's only part of your identity. And I think we do that in general. Sometimes we pick up a new skill, we get a new hobby, and that becomes our identity. And I think it's really important that mindfulness is just it's just one of the tools that we use, but it's not our identity.
Thanks for that, Dominic. I think just following on from that, we've been talking about mindfulness, we've been talking about meditation, and I think the concept of mindfulness in Islam is actually a virtuous concept, and something which is really built in to the faith. So, like the Muslim state of being mindful is actually something which is called muraqabah, something which it's having that continuous and full knowledge that God is aware of us, whether it's inwardly, whether it's outwardly. Being in that state of self-awareness in one's relationship with God, whether it's mind, body, soul, and that's the basis of mindfulness in Islam. That God's knowledge is having knowledge of God and knowing that He's always watching us, and naturally, as a consequence of this, we develop that greater attention. Like we mentioned previously, all of our actions are based around that. How is God? What's his sort of reaction, or knowing that God is watching us? How will he perceive these actions? So our thoughts, our feelings, our inner state of being, and again, being mindful is having that spiritual excellence. The Prophet, peace be upon him, he said, attaining that spiritual excellence, i.e., being mindful of God, is to worship God as if you see Him, i.e., meaning that, of course, we can't see God, but worshiping Him as though He is there. And even if you don't see Him, then it's knowing that He certainly sees you. So that's the concept of mindfulness in Islam. And of course, we know that God has names, He has attributes. Knowing that God is, the all-watcher, knowing that God is the guardian, knowing that God knows everything, knowing that God hears and He sees. This is something that we sort of practically implement in our daily lives. So whenever we do something, how we are to people, like I mentioned before, the way we react with them, the way we interact with them, knowing ultimately that this is a way that we get closer to God. And that's the concept of mindfulness in Islam.
Great, that's really really interesting to hear. And do you kind of recognize in what Dominic was saying about getting distracted and losing the I guess the sense of mindfulness in the sense of what you were just saying about mindfulness being kind of constantly aware of that presence of God. Does it take practice to maintain that level of mindfulness?
It does. You're right. I mean, look, everyone's on their own journey. So everyone with their relationship to God is at a different stage in their life. So again, it's practice. It's constantly reviewing yourself, and that's why we have the 5 daily prayers. So just taking that time out in your life, that time out in your day, where you sort of review yourself, you contemplate, you self-reflect, and you really see your position with God. Where do I sit? What's going on in my life? So yeah, it takes time and it takes practice. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that you gradually build and build and build. And so yeah, 100%. It's not something that happens immediately or straight away. It comes with practice and time, and over the course of a person's life. Like I mentioned, the concept in Islam is to gain your closeness to God, and being mindful, meditating in the different forms of meditation that we have, whether it's praying, whether it's simply sitting down and remembering God, whether it's reading the Quran. These are all ways and means that we can achieve that.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? In terms of like stopping distraction, from a Christian point of view, it's so easy to be distracted by your concerns, your worries, your trials and tribulations in life. But what I would do, and I'm sure what other Christians would do, is first of all, as I said before, is sit down before God and, you know, really do a heart check, you know, acknowledge your, the mistakes that you've made, you know, your sins, you know, what you've done to others and what others have done to you. Are you holding any resentment in your heart? Are you holding any hate in your heart? And to release that. And then from then, another thing that I do, and a lot of Christians do, is fasting as well. And Christian fasting is not based on the fact that you're not just eating, but it could be fasting from different things, from people, from different objects, but making sure that, you know, that time that you're fasting and so forth is to really, you know, spend time with Christ and have a Christ-like mind. And that's what mindfulness is for, you know, me, is to remember, as the Apostle Paul said, is to, you know, be mindful in the way we live, and it's always have a mind like Christ. So remember how Christ lived and his thoughts, and, you know, the love that he showed to others. So I think that is really important, in general, to kind of stop the distraction, and anything that is distracting you, that does distract you during your fast, that thing can be a problem, you know. So, you know, Jesus tells us to cast our burdens onto him. Therefore, we shouldn't really have to worry or be distracted by, you know, things that are around us that really do not matter.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I like what you said about kind of letting go of resentment, or if you're holding any hatred or anything like that. I think that's something we can all recognize as something that's really important, letting things like that go. And when it comes to meditation, I think it helps you to let things go. At least that's what I found personally. Yeah, I think it's a very important point. We don't have a lot of time left, but I just did have one more question. So one of my friends who I was talking to a long time ago now said to me that she wouldn't meditate because it was against her religion, and she was a Christian. So maybe I'll ask Fiona first. What would you say to somebody who has that kind of mindset or idea?
I think, like, even me, I'd say, to be honest, I was quite closed-minded when it came to meditation a few years back. But it really just takes, you know, doing research, or maybe asking, you know, a spiritual leader such as a priest or pastor, depending on what church you go to, their opinion or the church's opinion about meditation. To me, I don't see a problem with Christian meditation. So I believe in Christian meditation. And as I said before, it really is just putting yourself in the presence. So being in the spirit. And one way you can be in the spirit, again, is by fasting. Because when you fast, you're starving your flesh and you're feeding your spirit. So being in the spirit and being in one with God, the Father and the Holy Spirit, which is, you know, the Holy Trinity. And listening, you know, either lighting a candle and just listening to the word of God, or just sitting there and just remembering, you know, the promises that, you know, God has made. Everything should be based on, you know, passages in the Bible, you know, the word of God, the good news, as we call it. So that is what Christian meditation is. Now, if you're looking at it as a worldly point of view, then one may say as a Christian that, yeah, I can understand why a Christian wouldn't agree or want to partake in that activity. But there's nothing wrong with Christian meditation, because at the end of the day, you're centered and you're focused in the word of God. And that is what is the most important thing.
Okay, great, thanks. And Adil, have you ever experienced any of that same kind of mindset where people might be maybe confused by the term mindfulness or meditation and think that it's something that wouldn't be relevant to them?
Yeah. I mean, I think the word meditation, again, it probably has different connotations, and according to the person you asked, they have their own perception about it. So I think some Muslims, they're probably understandably hesitant or skeptical about the word meditation, because, like I said, there's so many different types of meditation. Some of which are, you know, associated with religious belief, and practices that maybe contradict the religion. So, but I think the fact of the matter is that, however, you know, meditation is you know, the predecessors, they practiced several forms of meditation and this is purely in the linguistic sense of the word. Sorry. I think the key to reviving these practices is to examine closely how they how these people or the scholars, they viewed meditation, and really to emulate these practices within the framework of Islamic creed, of worship, of ethics, of even etiquette. A great scholar of Islam, his name was Ibn al-Qayyim, and he provided one of the best and concise explanations of the many meanings of meditation in Islam. And he basically said that it's a integral part of preparing ourselves for the hereafter, and that's by reflecting, that's by remembering, that's by examining, that's by meditating, it's by contemplating, and essentially pondering. So each of these words, they represent different elements of something that a person does mentally, and all of these can be considered different forms of meditation. So like I mentioned before, I think all aspects of a person's life is ultimately meditation. And as Muslims, that meditation is a means of getting close to God, which is essentially the aim and objectives of this.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I guess it's just about misunderstanding of the words, really, and people kind of assign different connections which don't necessarily have to be there. In terms of lots of people might think that it's only for Buddhists or only for Hindus or something like that. But Dominic, on a similar kind of topic, lots of people, when they hear about meditation or if they see somebody meditating, they think that it's inherently spiritual. And that's been broadly what we've been talking about today, kind of like how it can be used in different spiritual contexts. But from an atheist perspective, what would you say to somebody who would think that meditation was only for spiritual people?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, really, because I think I definitely was somebody who thought of meditation. It's something I associated with like Taoism, just a religious practice essentially. And because I associated spirituality with the supernatural, and I never saw any reason to believe in anything supernatural because I never saw any evidence for it, and therefore that kind of discredited meditation for me. And when I was introduced to mindfulness a few years ago, it was my first year of teaching, we were given a course on mindfulness because the benefits it can have in somebody's life are really, really important in the learning environment. You've got students, particularly young kids, and I think a lot of adults forget how much you have to teach kids and how much they have to learn. They're not just learning maths in school, they're not just learning history, but they're learning how to socialize. And the skills that mindfulness can apport really, really help with that kind of socializing. Kids can be very impulsive, and they don't necessarily have the means to identify the physical sensations that they're experiencing, or the thoughts feelings that they're having. So mindfulness really helps with that. And I think once I was exposed to the benefits in that particular environment, that opened my eyes to what is meditation, what are the physical implications of meditating on your brain, and how can it be relevant to my life. And then it's just research, really. It's just that exposure and having an open mind in general. And I think that's kind of the key to it all. It's just having an open mind. And often people are in a phase of their life where they're just going to reject something because they're not ready yet. But and other times as I said, there was never any conflict with the religion for me, but definitely I did have reservations initially because I did associate it with religion.
Yeah, great, thank you. I know we've run over time a bit, so have we kind of missed anything, or is there anything that anybody's kind of eager to say before we finish? Dominic, you look like you want to say something.
I always want to say something. I think maybe just what I've often found upsetting when it comes to this religion and science debate is how people often think of it as a binary thing. It's like you're either religious or you're a scientist, and there are some great examples here to demonstrate that's not always the case. And I've always really respected people who can be religious but aren't afraid of testing their religious ideas by exploring science and thinking, okay, maybe not everything, or maybe there are different interpretations. And I would always just encourage people to explore, to experiment, and have your beliefs and have the strength and conviction to go out and test them, so that you really understand, have a real understanding of the laws of the world, what is nature, physics, and never let one deny the other. If that makes sense.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. I think a lot of literature around the science of health, mental health, well-being, flourishing. I mean, there are so many new ways, in which people are understanding what meditation, really means. I mean, there are religious ways in different religions, to sort of, in terms of how they understand meditation. But even in terms of science, I think it's really nice and heartening to know that there's a lot of push even within the the academic institutions to really scientifically test and study the impact of meditation or just a mindful life on your mental health or your well-being or your longevity or any of that. So I think that could be one way to really bridge this preconceived notion about the conflict between religion and science, because here's a practice that's really been religiously or at least spiritually or culturally or socially been practiced by different religions. I mean, there's no one authority to really claim as the originators, but I think this science, this evidence, as in how it comes to the fore in easy to understand language, can be a good way, can be a good meeting point between secular understanding of the human life and between a religious understanding of human life.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. Thank you. And so, William, I guess you're a scientist as well as a Buddhist. So do you ever see any conflict there?
No, not personally. I think for me, a spiritual practice should be able to work with science and embrace and accept scientific findings, and vice versa. I think science must and should be open to spiritual concepts, to things that perhaps aren't not perceivable with the naked eye. I think if science doesn't do that, it does itself an injustice, and I don't think that's real science if we deny things just because we can't see them. So I think, both. I think science and religion, or science and spirituality, can and should be compatible.
Great, yeah. Well, I think that's quite a nice note to end on, unless anybody has anything urgent they'd like to say. But yeah, I think the key thing that comes across here is that kind of whether you do come from a scientific background or a religious background, and no matter what religious background you do come from, mindfulness and meditation can really fit into your own practice, and it doesn't have to fit into a particular box. It can kind of be quite broad, and it can have true benefits for everybody. So thank you all very, very much for joining. It's been a really interesting conversation. I think I could probably talk for a few more hours if we had the time. Maybe we can do it again sometime. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.